Huw Edwards has avoided jail by being handed a suspended sentence after he was found guilty of possessing Category A indecent images of children. Disgraced BBC News presenter Huw Edwards has been given a 6-month prison sentence, suspended for 2 years after he admitted charges of making indecent images of children. The court heard that among a number of WhatsApp exchanges with a man later convicted of sex offences, Edwards was offered naughty images of somebody described as young, to which he replied, "Go on." He will be placed on the sex offenders register for 7 years. In July, the former newsreader admitted having 41 images which were sent to him on WhatsApp, including some showing a victim aged between 7 and 9. Now, all of our reaction to this is, why did he get a suspended sentence? Now, the judge took mitigating factors into consideration. One being that the judge didn't think he was a risk to the public, and it wasn't in the public interest to jail him. I mean, I very much disagree. Other reasons were pleading guilty at the first opportunity, no prior convictions, showing remorse. So all things taken into consideration, the judge reduced an initial jail sentence to pretty much allowing him to walk free. Now, if the judge was simply following guidelines, that tells me that maybe the guidelines are very, very wrong. Now, of course, this has sparked the two-tier policing debate again. This talking point has been pushed by the right. They are saying that people sharing posts went to prison, but a paedophile doesn't. Well, first of all, there were literal race riots. Essentially, we had pogroms on our streets, and some of it happened due to people posting on social media, instigating it. If you ask me, I think fascists should go to jail, and also, so should paedophiles. But the two-tier policing they don't talk about are Just Stop All activists getting 5 years for a Zoom call. What about the person who was sentenced to prison throwing a beer can at someone? And the context there is that the person was being racially abused and had a can thrown at them first, so he threw it back. I mean, that seems like a very normal response to me. Kevin, I want to get your thoughts on this. I mean, what do you make of a rich white man who works for the BBC getting what I would consider a very lenient punishment?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously ridiculously lenient, and I don't think any sensible person would think otherwise, which does call into question why the laws are the way they are. Why are they so pathetically lax? Why does Britain consistently, and this is a pattern of behaviour, not just at the BBC, but within the establishment more broadly, from the Catholic Church and the Church of England and their covering up of child sexual assault allegations for decades and decades. We've had obviously the BBC presenter scandal with Jimmy Savile and all the rest of it, and now we're seeing another kind of tranche of this type of thing happening. The British establishment has covered up and protected child sex abusers for a very long time now, and it needs to stop. It needs to stop, and it needs to stop now. Um, the laws need to be changed and tightened up very, very significantly, because anyone who was surprised that he didn't go to jail is not watching, is not following this kind of thing at all. Because not only was he never going to go to jail for this, because again, the mitigating circumstances, but the person who gave him the images was convicted and sentenced and didn't go to jail. 8 out of every 10 people who are found to have child sexual assault imagery about their property doesn't see a day in jail for it. 8 out of 10. This should be a national scandal. If there were going to be direct action incidents, it shouldn't be about fake stories about migrants in hotels. It should be about something like this. Not that I'm suggesting anyone should do anything like that, of course. But I'm suggesting that people need to be angry about this and should be massively angry about this. He should go to jail for a very long time. The idea that he's not a danger to society when he is engaging in and creating the market for this kind of abuse to take place, there's no distance that he has from the abuse taking place there. You are creating the financial incentive for that abuse to take place by continuing this, by perpetuating this. And why have we got a single non-violent person in jail if pedophiles are not being sent to jail? We keep being told that prisons are full. Why do people who, say, for instance, do bad things like not paying their council tax go to jail, and yet someone who wants to purchase child sexual abuse imagery does not? That is not a system fit to be called a justice system. It's a joke, it's a farce, and a disgrace to the country.
It's interesting, the point that you just made then about people not paying their council tax. Often states, especially the British state, see the biggest crime isn't murder, rape, paedophilia. The biggest crime is holding on to some sort of economic power,
Yeah,
as little power as you have, whether it's refusing to pay council tax, whether it's something else, whether it's private property being protected. I mean, we heard that story. I mean, I don't know if you did hear that story, but there was a story in America where police shot at a couple of people at a tube station because someone didn't pay the ticket, right? I mean, I don't think someone should be shot for not paying $2 for the ticket. And it just shows you that there are crimes, serious crimes being committed, and they get away with it, or the police don't seem to really give a shit. But protecting private property by way of not paying for a subway ticket or council taxes, that's a very serious issue. And of course, you understand the economic incentives there. You understand that the idea that people can have economic freedom, that's a real threat to people. And that is an entire different conversation we can have.
exactly. But I think it's a conversation worth having, because
Absolutely.
you see the amount of outrage from middle class pearl clutchers about a window that gets smashed at a rally or something like that, or they overturned a rubbish bin, or some
Mm.
really quite minor piece of property damage which can be fixed and will be covered by insurance, and no one really loses out at all. And yet, as you mentioned, sexual assault, be it against children or adults, is essentially de facto legal in this country. So few of the people who engage in it ever go to prison or face even prosecution for their crimes. Indeed, the police are found repeatedly to be the perpetrators of those crimes. Um, that it's essentially de facto legal. And we do have to ask ourselves the question as a nation, how morally bankrupt do we want to be? In that we'll defend a window, but we won't defend a woman or a child or a man or anyone else for that matter from the repeated bestialities of sexual assault.
Yeah, I entirely agree, and it's also very dangerous when more and more people question our legal system. Now it's incredibly flawed. I mean, we can talk about excuse me, systemic issues within it, whether it's protecting pedophiles, whether it's systemic racism, whether it's, like I said, jailing climate activists for a Zoom call, for God's sake. But when you have widespread loss of trust in our legal institutions, it's very dangerous and often leads to the rise of the far right and their conspiracy, which is exactly what they're doing. They have
Yeah.
jumped on this. So I
Oh
do
yeah.
want to ask you about two-tier policing. Now, I think some people when they try to take on the right wing line that there's no two-tier policing, there absolutely is. It's just not what the right thinks it is. If you are a
Yeah.
rich, powerful, if you have a public profile, that tends to be in your favor. But, if you're someone who challenges power or you go against the British state, whether that's taking on the oil industry or standing up for Palestine, they don't go easy on you. So I want to get your response to those trying to make it a right wing political talking point, because you will notice that thousands took to the streets to riot, but he's saying people aren't smashing up BBC buildings, which I thought they cared about protecting children.
Mm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the real well, one of the problems with not sending people like Huw Edwards to jail, when found obviously guilty and pled guilty themselves, is that you do lead to this kind of two-tier policing system, and it
Mm.
isn't two-tier in the way that they mean. 'Cause like you say, people who've done similar things to Huw Edwards have been treated the same. There isn't preferential treatment for Huw Edwards specifically because he's rich or famous. If you're poor and not famous and you commit this crime, you also probably won't go to jail. So it isn't quite, the two-tier policing system they mean there. And like you say, the right want to pretend that rioting to burn down immigrants is going to protect women and children, but yet will stay silent on things like this, or will use it for their own political ends. Or indeed, when someone is pretty blatantly committing crimes like this, like Andrew Tate, will actively come out and support them. They don't care about protecting women or girls or anyone else for that matter. They certainly don't give a damn about the country more broadly. What they want to do is essentially violent racism without repercussion. Many of the people who've engaged in this kind of activity in the past have themselves been guilty of the kind of predations that Huw Edwards has engaged in. The amount of people who have been associated with the likes of Tommy Robinson, who have been outed as pederasts of one variety or another is a list that's pretty extensive at this point. Racism and other kinds of moral degeneracy, for want of a better phrase, go hand in hand. Rarely does one person engage in one of them without engaging in several others. It's a kind of basic moral defect to engage in this level of like abuse and targeting of vulnerable and innocent people.
Yeah, it's really striking that the judge, one of the reasons to mitigate the sentence was to say that it's not in the public interest to jail this person. And I'm thinking, what planet are you on? I mean, this country specifically is quite, in terms of attitude towards authority, quite likes it. We like harsh sentences as a country. Like, if you ask most people, they want tougher sentences on pretty much anything. Now, of course, like we, on some things, we think that should not be a crime, and we'll have disagreements with people. But clearly, it's in the public interest to jail a paedophile, and the judge is so out of touch that he's saying, "I don't think it's in the public interest." Really wacky, crazy
Yeah.
thing to say.
He's a
Insane.
high court judge. I would expect nothing different to them. These are people who spend their days in powdered wigs and yet see nothing weird or
Mm.
deranged about that situation. That's their normal, everyday professional practice. Of course, they have no interaction with the real world. Of course, they don't. Of course, they have no inclination whatsoever as to public opinion on this. Not that I'm suggesting that public opinion should necessarily lead an individual sentencing guideline or anything like that. But the idea that this is not in the public interest, I don't think you'd find more than 100 people in the entire country who would agree with that. And
Mm.
yet he is one of them. And I would suggest that of those 100, probably 20 of them are also high court judges, I would imagine.
Well, one of them who does agree with the sentence is William Hague. He went on TV and said it's probably the right sentence. Again, I think even if you personally
It,
agree with it, why would
yeah,
you openly say that on
it's
TV?
it's very strange. You can tell he's not
Crazy.
standing for election anymore. Interesting, isn't it?
Absolutely. If he was standing
Uh,
for election, you'd probably call for the death penalty.
Yes, I imagine so. It depends in the context he says it, because I didn't hear him say this. If he means he thinks that's the like, morally correct decision, then he's clearly wrong and mad and
Mm.
should be removed from any positions of power and authority he's ever possessed. But if he means the judge made the right call, as in within the usual sentencing guidelines and the specificities of that, he probably is correct. Because again, anyone who was surprised by this doesn't follow these instances, has
Yeah.
no interest in this topic or no real sort of insight into it, because I never expected him for a second to go to jail. He has no previous on this. He pled guilty. He was never going to jail. And that is the kind of point. The fact that even with those mitigations, you should still go to jail. You are clearly a danger to the public.
Well, I mean, here's the thing. So William Hague, I mean, maybe ask him again. I doubt you say morally. He probably does mean in terms of like, oh, the judge followed the right rules and guidance. But to me, obviously, we're having a discussion that the rules and guidance should be changed. But judges also have the autonomy. Like they also have to decide. It's not like they're bound to it. It's not like, oh well, I jailed Huw Edwards, I'm fired now. No, because there are so many instances where they'll take things into account and then they imply their own judgment on it. So, for example, the race riots and the example I gave earlier on, where there was a person of color had a beer can thrown at them, was getting racist abuse, and the person threw the can back and was arrested for it and got sentenced to jail. And he said, "Well, I was responding to someone who was racist to me," and the judge said, "Well, you know, you need to be better at controlling yourself." That was the judge making a moral argument there. Said, "Okay, well, here's the guidelines, but actually, I'm still going to send you to prison." So judges have that power. So I completely agree with you in terms of the actual guidelines, and maybe William Hay was talking about that. But still, even within those guidelines, judges have the power to do that. So I
Yeah,
think it's not just the policy in place, it's not the systems in place, it's the culture around it. But I guess, I mean,
yeah.
we come full circle here. Systems create cultures. I guess that's what
Eh,
it is. If we
yeah.
change the system, you might disincentivize judges not banging up pedophiles.
Well, exactly. Yeah, they have to go by the sentencing guidelines, and they do have some scope, of course. Like in theory, he could have sent him to jail, and again,
Mm,
probably should have done. But on the basis that if the justice has to be blind, that if this weren't Hugh Edwards and he wasn't going to face the backlash for it, would he act differently? I would demand that he would act in exactly the same way, because you're supposed to be blind. It shouldn't matter who you are and what position you are.
mm.
But like you say, the law creates the culture as much as the culture creates the law. They kind of
Yeah.
they interact in a way that that societies have always interact, or at least vaguely democratic ones have. Um, we need to change the laws and toughen them up very significantly. We need to, or not even necessarily the laws as such, but certainly the sentencing guidelines behind these laws, and probably the laws themselves. But that's a different matter.
Mm.
In order to force judges to have to now implement, some a mandatory minimum for a crime like this. That I think is a perfectly reasonable thing to ask and indeed demand. If we're to ever make any dent in this, because again, it's de facto basically legal. Again, 8 out of 10 who are found to be in possession. So that's even the tiny percentage who ever get caught. A tiny percentage of those ever see jail, which means it's basically legal, which means it's never going to stop. Okay, we're never expecting it to completely stop because that's not how
Mm.
societies and humans interact. But we're never going to curtail it. We're never going to have any effective deterrent to it if this is just allowed to happen. What does this? Think about what this sentencing, or frankly lack thereof, says to pedophiles in the country right now. Knock yourselves out, lads. Nothing's going to happen to you.
Patreon.com, Turn Left Media. Support independent media. Support social justice that's there on social media. Thank you, Turn Left.